All right, up next, we have Luiz Brito with Purdue. Dr. Luiz Brito is an associate professor of quantitative genetics and genomics in the Department of Animal Science at Purdue University. Since joining Purdue in 2018, his research program has focused on the integration of multiple data sources, large scale and high throughput phenotypes, and omics derived data sets to reveal the genetic basis underlying the phenotypic variability in livestock behavior, welfare, and climatic resilience, and the development of selection methods and approaches to enable efficient incorporation of these traits into livestock breeding programs. Luis's talk is also sponsored by the National Pork Board, and he's going to be talking about improving sow longevity through genetic selection, advances, and opportunities. So,
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be back here at the Leman conference and see many of you guys here. And I thank the organizers for the invitation to come here and share some of our work with you guys. So we have talked a lot about the importance of sow longevity in this conference here. And so from a genetics perspective, why is this so important? So if we look at the data, so for example, in 2024, it was estimated a 16% mortality rate in the US, which has climbed from 8% in 2012. So let's look at one example here where we consider two 2000 sow farms, and we have then farm A and farm B. So if we consider a 45% annual replacement rate, so that would mean, let's say, 900 gilts that would be replaced. And if we have in farm A a 20% death loss, and in farm B we have a 10% death loss. If we have a 20% death loss, that means this would be equivalent to 400 sows, and we'll then be culling 25%, so that would give us 500 sows to add up to the 900 replacement animals. In the case of farm B, where we have a 10% death loss, that would be equivalent to 100 sows, and therefore we would be culling 35% of the sows, or 700 out of the 900 that we are going to be replacing. This means that between the two, due to this difference in the death loss rate, that would be additional 200 sows per year with, let's say, improvement of culling, where we may make better decisions by removing those sows with lower genetic merit for traits related, for example, to milk production, to behavior, to farrowing, health, and so on. So we can improve our culling decisions when we have lower death loss rates in our farms. In addition, there are reports indicating that a sow must remain in the herd for, let's say, for 3 parities to produce enough piglets to pay or to reach a positive net return and pay for her rearing costs. Also, we know that mortality rates, they tend to be higher, as well as daily weight gain tends to be lower in gilt progeny as compared to the progeny of older sows. Also, when we have higher rate of replacement of those sows, there is a greater impact on the destabilization of the immune status of the herd, as we have more new animals coming to our herds as compared to lower replacements. In addition to that, reduced longevity and also increased involuntary culling, these have an environmental, ethical, and animal welfare implications. And therefore, we need to work towards increasing sow longevity and reducing especially involuntary culling rates. And it is important for us to remember that the phenotype, or what we measure, in this case, let's say sow longevity, it depends on the genetics of the animals, it depends on the environment, as we have mentioned or given multiple examples here, so talking about diet, different types of disease, and the facilities and so on, as well as an interaction between genotype and environment. In other words, the individuals or the genotypes that perform better in one environment, let's say nucleus herds condition, as compared to, let's say, commercial farms, they may not always be the same. So we may have a genotype by environment interaction that we may need to account for. So when we are breeding for improved sow longevity, I think there are a couple points that are important for us to consider. The first one is to define our breeding objective. So we need to include sow longevity explicitly as a trait of economic, welfare, and overall sustainability importance, so that when we are defining our selection indexes, we are counting and giving the proper economic weight to this trait. Then we need to choose the appropriate indicator traits or the auxiliary traits that will be part of our selection criteria. So what are we selecting for? So the most common indicators of sow longevity are length of productive life, usually measured in days, removal age, removal parity, stayability up to a certain parity that indicates the ability of the sow to stay in the herd until a certain parity, lifetime piglet output, either at birth or up to weaning. And there are also many other relevant traits that will impact the ability of the sows to remain in the herd. This includes traits related to leg conformation, early reproductive success, prolapse, and other health traits as well. So there are those, as I mentioned here, that are more direct indicators of longevity, and other traits that will impact the ability of the sow to stay in the herd or reduce the rates of involuntary culling. And also, after we identify those traits that may be a target, we need to estimate their genetic parameters. So in other words, we need to know how heritable those traits are, how genetically correlated they are among themselves, as well with other important traits that we are selecting for. And we need to know the amount of additive genetic variance that we have in our specific populations. Then, as a third step, we need to improve our recording systems. And I want to emphasize here, and I will show you some results later, on the importance of having standardized and accurately recorded culling reasons. So it is very common that we are analyzing data sets, and there is a very large proportion of sows that were removed from the herd or culled for unknown reasons. So the more recorded information we have, the better we can breed for improved sow longevity. Another very important point is to integrate commercial data with nucleus herd information, because most of the selection decisions, they're happening in the nucleus farms, and the animals are going to be performing in commercial conditions. And we know that there is quite a lot of difference on the disease pressure and the environmental conditions. So integrating data from commercial farm conditions in our selection schemes is very beneficial. Fourth, we need to apply advanced genetic evaluation models. So for example, we need to use models that separate voluntary from involuntary removal reasons. And we also need to account for genotype by environment interaction. So for example, when we have animals performing in nucleus versus commercial farm environment, so this needs to be accounted for in our genetic evaluations. And I think now most breeding companies are already using genomic information, and sow longevity is one of the types of traits that benefit the most from genomic information. So including data, genomic information, phenotypic records, and also data from crossbred populations, that is very beneficial for improving sow longevity. We also need to leverage new phenotyping tools. So, for example, use data from sensors, cameras, automated monitoring for let's say, locomotion, conformation, resilience, early diagnostic of disease, and so on, so that we can more accurately phenotype those animals and add those traits in our selection schemes. And then as we are selecting for these indicators of sow longevity, we also need to evaluate our genetic trends so that we can quantify our genetic progress over time. And we also need to be continually updating the economic and environmental impact of improved sow longevity. So what is the impact that this selection has had in our breeding programs and production systems in general? There are some key challenges when we are breeding for improved sow longevity. So the first one is that the phenotypes are usually obtained late in the life of the animal. So we only have the record of a sow when she's culled, right? Then an opportunity here is for us to identify novel traits that are genetically correlated with sow longevity so that we can make selection decisions early on. Also, with genomic information, we can obtain accurate genomic breeding values while a sow is still in the herd. So in other words, we can make selection decisions early on based on the genetic information of those animals. A second challenge is the fact that we have sensor data. So young animals, we still don't have their information for longevity. And also when we have voluntary culling, that means we did not give the opportunity of a sow to express her genetic potential for longevity. And therefore we have sensor data. However, with genomic selection, we can obtain accurate genomic breeding values for these animals even before we actually have their own phenotype. And this will facilitate selection for improved sow longevity. The third one that's often ignored is the fact that there are different culling reasons, and those tend to have different biological process behind them. So for example, one sow that is removed from the herd because, let's say, reproductive issue is very different biologically from a sow that is removed because of, let's say, leg conformation, right? So we need to take into consideration that different culling reasons have different underlying biological process behind them. And therefore we need new definitions of sow longevity and novel traits that will help us with selection or improved selection for sow longevity. Also, there is quite strong genotype by environment interaction, especially when we do selection using only data from nucleus herds, but then the animals are going to be performing under commercial conditions. So we need to collect and include crossbred data in our genomic evaluations. So now I will talk about some of the results or some of the research that we have done on this area where we partner with PIC to estimate variance components and genetic parameters for length of productive life, removal age, removal parity, and stayability to different parities based on voluntary and involuntary culling reasons in both purebred and crossbred maternal pig populations incorporating genomic information. So we had data for more than 26,000 sows with phenotypic records from 2015 to 2024, close to 15,000 landrace from 6 farms, and close to 12,000 landrace large white raised in 9 different farms. We included sows that had at least one farrowing record, that had their first farrowing between 300 and 500 days, that had contemporary groups with at least 5 individuals. We had close to 23,000 animals with genomic information and over 5 million animals in the pedigree file. When we look at the removal categories, so there were a much more detailed information, and we categorized them in those groups that I'm showing here, so feet and legs, health, prolapse, reproduction, sudden death, age, genetic, other, and unknown. We see that in this case, including the data of both purebred and crossbred, we had close to 68% removed due to involuntary reasons and close to 30% due to voluntary reasons. When we look at the distribution based on culling reasons, so we see around 25% due to reproduction, 21% due to genetic, which is more higher in the purebred population, health, and then we see that in this case it's very positive. There is only 3% with unknown reasons. When we look at the descriptive statistics for these traits, so especially if you look, for example, length of productive life, considering both purebred and crossbred, with 278 days, removal age of 625, and 2.89 removal parity when we have both purebred and crossbred. And as expected, when we look at the crossbred population, these numbers are much higher because they tend to remain in the herds for a longer period. When we look at the removal based on the parity in which they were removed, we see that close to 80% of them are removed before or at the fourth parity, with an average of 2.89. These culling reasons, they have different distribution across parities. So for example, if we see genetics or sows that were removed because of lower genetic merit, they will have a higher proportion in earlier parities, and of course due to age, that as expected in later parities. Then we also see, for example, feet and legs in the earlier parities, and a couple others that are more common throughout the whole stage. Then, when we analyze this data, we look at different scenarios. So first we had the purebred and crossbred data, considering both voluntary and involuntary reasons. Then we had the purebred and crossbred separately, and we included both voluntary and involuntary reasons. Then we had purebred and crossbred, including only involuntary reasons. Then we had purebred and crossbred, but separately and only for involuntary reasons. And then only the purebred, but we analyzed each involuntary reason separately. Now, looking at the results, first, when we analyze the purebred and crossbred data together, and also including the involuntary and voluntary culling reasons, we observe quite moderate to high heritability estimates, which are very encouraging. 0.28 for length of productive life, removal age, and 0.30 for removal parity. When we look at only the purebred population, so we also observe moderate heritabilities around 0.20 to 0.22. When we look at only the crossbred, we observe slightly lower heritability estimates, but still comparable to many traits that we make very good genetic progress in our populations. When we look at the involuntary reasons, so considering first the purebred and crossbred data only for the involuntary reasons, the heritability estimates are lower, but it is still heritable. When we look at only the purebred, we observe slightly higher heritabilities, and also for the crossbred, we observe that sow longevity is heritable. So both when we consider voluntary and involuntary reasons together, or when we consider only the involuntary reasons, we observe that sow longevity is heritable with substantial additive genetic variance. And another very positive point is that the genetic correlation between these three traits is basically 1, so 0.99, indicating that we can only pick one of those for selection. We do not need to select for all of those traits. Then we also look on the genotype by environment interaction by calculating for each one of those traits the genetic correlation between the phenotypes recorded in the purebred and the phenotypes recorded in the crossbred population. When we included both voluntary and involuntary removal reasons, the heritability was very small, close to 0. So indicating that when we are considering both voluntary and involuntary, they are basically different traits. When we consider only the involuntary removal reasons, then the heritabilities or the genetic correlations, they were more moderate. So indicating that the involuntary culling reasons in both the purebred and the crossbred, they have a more similar genetic basis. But overall, what this slide here tells us is that we do need to collect data in crossbred populations and also use this information in our genetic evaluation systems. Now, when we look or when we analyze genetic parameters, including only data from the purebred population and analyzing each involuntary removal or longevity due to each involuntary reason, first we observe that feet and legs, it is heritable. So when we define longevity based on the animals that were removed due to feet and leg issues, when we observe health, also heritable, so we can breed animals to reduce their involuntary culling due to health issues. And one that we're very excited is prolapse. That was a quite high heritability, much higher than we would expect. So 0.28, so when animals were removed due to prolapse. And you can see that because of the reduced number of individuals that were removed because of prolapse, we see that the standard errors is slightly higher. For reproduction, the heritability is much lower, indicating that there is a much larger environmental component on removal due to reproduction. And then sudden death, there were very few animals that were removed because of sudden death. And then, so for length of productive life and removal age, the analysis did not converge. But for removal parity, we observed an estimate of 0.06. However, it had a very large standard error. So overall, we see that the heritabilities, they range based on the removal reason. When we look at the genetic correlation between them, so for example, feet and legs and health, they have a very high genetic correlation, so indicating that those two removal based on feet and legs and health overall, that they share a quite large genetic basis. When we compare feet and legs and prolapse, 0.66, they are also moderately genetically correlated. Feet and legs with reproduction and fertility, they have a slightly lower genetic correlation, but also favorably correlated. Health and prolapse, also 0.7. And health and reproduction of fertility, 0.89. And prolapse and reproduction of fertility, 0.34. However, a slightly larger standard error. So what these results show us is that even though we are interested in improving cell longevity, the genetic background underlying each removal reason varies. And therefore, we should take this into consideration when we are designing or refining our breeding programs. We also look at stayability, which basically we describe whether a sow stays in the herd until a certain time point. So let's say stayability to first parity, second, third, fourth, and fifth parity. So this is basically defined as a binary trait. So if we just look a couple IDs here, an individual that did not farrow, that should have 0 for all 5 traits. An animal that was removed in her first parity should only have the stayability 1, and one that was removed in her second parity would have a value for stayability 1 and 2, and so on. So we look up to parity 5. When we look at the descriptive statistics, where basically here the column of the average, it represents the proportion of animals that were kept up to that parity. So we can see stability 1 more than 90% when considering both the purebred or purebred and crossbred. And just to emphasize that in the case of the stability to first parity, we also included those animals that were able to reproduce but that did not show estrus or were inseminated but did not get pregnant. And so we can see that the stability, of course, it will reduce over time. So the first one we see here more than 90%, and then up to period 5, close to 20%. And in this case here we are considering both purebred and crossbred. When we analyze only for the crossbred, then those proportions of animals that were kept would be higher. When we look at the heritability for those traits, we see that they are all moderately heritable. So for example, stability to different parities, when we consider only the purebred or only the crossbred population, they are all heritable. So we can select for the ability of animals to be retained in the herds until specific parities. And when we consider only the involuntary reasons, we also observe slightly lower heritability estimates as compared to when we have both voluntary and involuntary reasons, but we still see that it is heritable. This is not specific to this population, so we published a book chapter this year where we summarized other genetic parameters for different longevity traits, and we see that across studies from all over the world, it is heritable. So we can select, we can breed for improved cell longevity. When we look at the genetic correlations, there is much more variability across studies. So we usually see that there is favorable genetic correlation with reproductive performance. Age at first farrowing tends to have a negative correlation with longevity, but it is a quite low genetic correlation. And usually we see favorable correlation with the first litter size and the lifetime productivity of the cells. When we look the correlations with growth and body composition, they are generally weak or non-significant, but there has been some antagonistic correlations reported with lean meat percentage and also some unfavorable links, although low, with average daily gain and back fat thickness. With feet and leg conformation, there are usually positive genetic correlations with cell longevity, ranging from 4 to 36%. So now coming back to the end, so there are opportunities when we are talking about improving cell longevity to refine our selection indexes, and breeding companies are working on this regard for refining their selection indexes, for adding new indicators of fertility and reproduction, health-related traits, prolapse, feet and leg conformation, using more accurate recording systems such as cameras, for instance. There are multiple phenotyping technologies, including automated feeders, cameras, that are being implemented for improving management, for improving disease detection, and also for generating data for deriving novel traits that can be included in breeding programs. Also, a great opportunity is to incorporate crossbred data in genomic evaluations, and for that it is important that we have accurate and complete culling reasons in the commercial forms as well. I think another great opportunity in the coming years will be gene editing. So we saw this year that came up the PRRS virus resistant pigs, and I think in the coming years this will be a very important technology as well. So as some final considerations, cell longevity, they are heritable with sufficient additive genetic variance. The genetic basis of cell longevity depends on the culling reason, and we observe that feet and legs health and prolapse were the 3 involuntary culling reasons with the greater heritability estimates, and there is a need for better recording of culling reasons as we look in the literature and different production systems. We also see that there is significant genotype by environment interaction for sow longevity. So especially when we talk about purebred versus crossbred forming conditions, and highlighting the importance of including crossbred data in the genetic evaluations. Novel technologies for recording indicators of sow longevity, they are being widely adopted, especially in the nucleus herds and in some commercial farms as well. And I think this will become more and more important. And accurate data from commercial farms, they are of great importance. With that, I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation, to thank our sponsors, and thank you for your attention. I would be happy to take any questions as well. Thank you very much.
All right, I think we have time for one question. I'd have one.
Okay.
So you talk about the importance of including the crossbred data, and there's a lot of variation between how the environment impacts that. So is there some considerations on the environment that you select for your crossbred farms to take your genomic data from?
Yes, that's a great question. And what I would say, so first we need to do a better job on characterizing the environment. So even in the nucleus herds, a lot of times we may have, let's say, the effect of contemporary group, or like, let's say, temperature, humidity, or farm effect. I think we need to add more granularity on the characterization of the environment, even in nucleus herds. And then when we are talking about the commercial farms, I think the more variability on the data sets or the environments that we have, the better our reference populations will be. So if we can collect data in a wider range of commercial farms where the genetics that we are selecting for are going to be performed, that would be better. And there are cases where certain farms may have both purebred and crossbred animals. So let's say in some of the multiplications farms, for instance, that is also a very good opportunity, because then you may have, let's say, crossbred animals that are closer linked to the purebred nucleus population that are performing in an environment that is more similar to the crossbred environment. So I think the key would be to characterize better the environment, and also to have animals performing in those commercial conditions where the genetics that the companies are going to be sold will be performing.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's thank Luiz one more time, and thank you all for joining the Sow Longevity session.